Good evening, everyone who's joined us. Good evening, good evening. It's 8 o'clock. Oh, Amen. Oh, Amen. Om. Amen. So we're starting with St. Francis's humility and compassion. Heidi, would you like to read it for us, please?
Sure. Humility and compassion. Can true humility and compassion exist in our words and eyes unless we know we too are capable of any act?
Okay, read it again, please.
Humility and compassion. Can true humility and compassion exist in our words and eyes unless we know we too are capable of any act?
This is a pretty powerful question. Anybody want to be responsive?
I couldn't really distinguish all the words. Could we read it again?
Yes, please read it very slowly and distinctly, Heidi,
Okay,
if you would please.
here we go. Humility and compassion. Can true humility and compassion exist in our words and eyes unless we know we too are capable of any act?
Did you receive it that time, June? Did it come
Yes.
through? Okay. Anything to say about it?
No, I haven't digested it yet.
Okay. Well, let me tell a little story about it and how important this particular verse became to me. I think all of us know the name Fred Rogers of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
Yes.
Um, for a long time, and I mean a long time, I had been trying to understand how Fred Rogers could say to someone, anyone, I like you just the way you are. I like you just the way you are, which he did say
Yes.
to everyone. And I thought, how can this be? How can he say this? I knew that he was spiritually trained, that he was a minister, and so on. But even so, that didn't solve it for me until I read this verse. If we, if Fred Rogers, whether this verse was known to him, whether this is what uh, he knew the message of this, whether he ever read this particular verse or not. If we too are capable of acknowledging that we are capable of any act, given enough provocation, given the right circumstances, we too are capable of any act. And if we acknowledge that within ourselves, then whatever we are met with, then, like Fred Rogers, true compassion and humility could come from his words and eyes. And if you remember, his gaze was so loving and affectionate. So that's how this verse came to be so important to me. It helped me understand how Fred Rogers could say to anyone, I like you just the way you are. So that's my story. I'm sticking to it. Anybody else got anything?
I have a comment, Brother Shankara.
Yes, please, Haima.
Yes, the true humility and compassion exist in our words and eyes. Yes, we are capable of act. Uh, it has to come from the heart, like Fred Rogers. It always came from his heart. I watched every show of his when my children were growing. Everything came from the bottom of his heart. Truly.
Yes.
If it is in our hearts, truly, that humility and compassion, it shows up on your eyes and words. That's how I believe.
Yes.
Just my belief. That's all. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Haima.
Thank you.
Brother Shankara,
Yes, dear.
we did read in the previous poem a line which said, a kind face is a precious gift.
Yes, we did. We finished that. So that's what we finished with last week.
Right.
Did you say, I'm sorry, did I misunderstand you? Did you say we didn't read that poem?
Yes. I said
No,
we read.
We did read that poem.
Maybe, Swam, maybe you had already left. Do you have another class tonight on Monday nights? Or is
Yeah.
that another night?
I do.
Okay, because you might have left and then we read that one right at the very end, I think.
So I remember having been there for that. That's why I said I remember that we read it.
Oh, okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. I
Either
totally misunderstood you. I thought you said we didn't read it.
No, I said we did. Read it. I
Ah,
remembered.
so yeah, and now we've read this one about humility and compassion. Anything else from anyone?
This is one of my favorites in here, and I think it's very powerful. Unless, how can we have compassion, real compassion for others, and humility, which is, I think, required of compassion, unless we know we too are capable of any act, which to me means, you can't look at somebody, for instance, who's in prison and say, oh, I feel compassion for this person, but it's kind of this downward, you're still kind of looking down on them because
Mm-hmm.
you would never have done whatever it was that they did,
Mm-hmm.
land in prison, or someone to end up homeless, or um, it's like people who are in prison for life because they committed a murder. And that was, psychopaths, real psychopaths aside, there are people that under certain circumstances, they did this really awful thing and they took somebody's life, but that was a moment in their life. And people do change and can change. And we don't know. Most of us have no idea what we would do if we were in similar circumstances, or really, really difficult circumstances, whether we might do things that we think we never would.
That
But
I think is what the saint is saying, all right.
yeah, don't, you can't think I would never do something that this other human being has done. Because if you say that, you're saying that you are better than this person. And you cannot have true compassion for somebody when you feel above them.
Well, if we look on the life of Father Thomas Keating, part of his ministry was regularly visiting people in prison who had committed murder. And there's a very moving testimony by one man about how Keating's complete acceptance of him, no, as you said, Cindy, no looking downward, no looking askance at what he'd done, just complete acceptance of him. He said it transformed his life. No one had ever dealt with him that way. And so he became, though he was in prison for life without possibility of parole, he was not upset or resentful, or it was really remarkable what Father Thomas Keating did. And that was part of his ministry.
Well, I like to say, in order to make this statement that I like you just the way you are, and be able to say that to anyone and everyone, you would have to have gained a certain control over the ego to the degree that you have an understanding that, first of all, this world is not about me. That would be the first level of it. And then in order, if you recognize that you're in a position to be able to appreciate another person and their position and wherever it is that they're coming from. And I would disagree with you, Cindy, about I don't think it would be looking down on another person to feel that I wouldn't do that. I think another level of that would be coming from an understanding of that person and being able to see or understand why that person is doing what they're doing. So it's not coming from looking down on them, it's coming from a desire to be able to help them understand and raise their level of approach to that situation.
I think, Robert, you've just given us a very good definition of the word compassion. I think that's what's meant by compassion.
Yeah.
My comments about that were, about this poem, not necessarily, what I in my actual working life feel or believe. I would like to feel that way. I'd like to feel like Mr. Rogers. I'd like to feel like Saint Francis. I don't know that I actually do, but yeah, I hear what you're saying, Robert, and about understanding. And I still feel like it's hard to understand another person if you don't feel like you haven't you have enough in common. I mean, it's hard to be in somebody else's shoes if you can't imagine yourself being in their shoes. I mean, that's what standing in somebody's shoes is about. Anyway.
Look what just a few words of such potency can produce in the way of conversation.
Well, I think we tend to feel that we have to judge,
Mm-hmm.
and that gets in the way of compassion.
Yes.
God doesn't call us to judge.
Mm-mm.
He's the judge.
And if these saints are accurate in representing what they know, he's a very forgiving judge indeed.
Yes.
Talking about judgment, I recently read somewhere that good experience comes from, good judgment comes from experience,
Mhm.
but good experience comes from bad judgment.
That's great.
Yes, well, that's yep, that's we're
But
all,
is there such a thing as good and bad judgment?
well, for yourself perhaps not, Robert, but I certainly can look back on the years of my 20s and say, well, many of the decisions that I made did not reflect very good judgment.
I think we all can look back and say that same thing.
There's a quote that I heard on a television show decades ago, but I've always loved it. And somebody said, "A wise person is just a fool with a good memory."
I like that too.
Yeah, yeah.
Anything else before we
Well,
move on to the
just
next one?
one quick comment about the prison scenario. A friend of mine said to me many years ago, it was a male friend, and he said, not everybody in prison is a bad person.
Mhm.
And that just stuck with me. And I think you could use that same phrase for, many different things. So that stuck with me, and I looked at that particular situation differently after he said that to me. So,
And a Father Thomas Keating might say, there's no one in prison that is a bad person. There are people in prison who did bad things.
bad things, right?
And there is that all forgiving divine presence.
Just one other comment, and I can't remember if somebody said this in the class. I mean, not the class, the talk. Did you read this you read this in a recent talk, didn't you, Brother Shankara?
What this poem?
Yeah.
Yes, I did some weeks ago. Yeah.
Maybe it was you, but somebody, talked about how people say, um, when they see someone in a really unfortunate situation, there, but for the grace of God go I,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is what this poem also is. It's
Yeah.
another way of saying that.
That's an angled mirror on this poem.
Mhm.
There, but for the grace of God go I. If you can say that with real sincerity, then you're mirroring what this poem says, indeed. Anybody else? All right. Swayam, would you like to read Always from the Child's Hand?
Okay. Always from the child's hand. Always from the child's hand, the sword should be removed. I think every nation is an infant. Always from the child's hand. Always from the child's hand, the sword should be removed. I think every nation is an infant.
Another very short poem with tremendous implications.
Could you read that again?
Always from the child's hand. Always from the child's hand, the sword should be removed. I think every nation is an infant.
I think it's very, so somebody else was going to talk, please.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, when we raise children, it's just an instinct that when they go near the kitchen, we always stop them from picking up sharp instruments like knives.
Mhm.
So it's an instinct against hurting themselves or others, to protect them from hurting themselves or others.
But I think this has wider implications. This
Right.
is about the fact that human beings war with one another. And I think it's very interesting that in the first sentence, the word child is used. In the second sentence, the word infant is used. These nations are not even grown up enough to be called a child. And an infant couldn't hold a sword. Certainly shouldn't be allowed, as you said, near sharp objects. I think this is one of St. Francis's remarks against warfare. And it's important for us to understand that as a young man, as the biography of him that we read pointed out, he went to war twice. First in an inner city warfare in Italy itself, between Assisi and Perugia, I think. And the second, he went on crusade and was in Turkey. So he knew about nations and swords and warfare.
I think this even applies to our political situation that we have right now. To put a person in office that's not on an emotional or psychological or intellectual level to be able to be responsible or to handle an office like the President of the United States, or a judge that's going to be passing sentences down on people, or a minister in a church that it doesn't have the proper correct understanding of what the religion is about. That kind of, it doesn't have to be something that's a sharp object or something that's going to wound a person physically, but it could be something that's going to, more importantly, something that's going to affect people emotionally and psychologically and spiritually as beings on the planet.
Well, very good, Robert. You've taken it and made it a bigger metaphor. And yes, of course, that's there.
And just to add to that, I think it's just like there is warfare of all kinds, and I think Robert just described some of those. And instead of looking for a peaceful solution, nations, war is the first thing you think of.
Right.
You don't try to work it out and have peace. And so that's kind of what I hear in this poem is like, war versus peace in a nutshell.
Yes, and that exists within us as well as outside of us.
Yeah.
Anything else about this one before we go on to the next one?
Well, yeah, one thing that just kind of comes to my mind about the idea of war, and like this war going on in us, I think there's also, and I just want to be clear because not to make it sound like I'm advocating war between nations, but the war within us, I think it's,
Class, I can't talk.
we, like sometimes I think we need to, if you look at the Bhagavad Gita, right? I mean, Arjuna is a warrior, and a large part of the dialogue is about it's Krishna telling him to take up arms, and I think that for me, what's coming up is like there are certain wars that we may have to go into battle, but we have to do it with we have to practice the disciplines in order to approach it from an adult point of view rather than from the child's point of view, because I think that's where the danger comes in hand. It's kind of like the metaphor a lot of martial arts instructors use of like the ninja, the warrior in the garden. It's like we should strive to be the gardener, but when the times arise, we need to be skilled in order to handle these challenging situations, whether you want to call it war or just life.
Well, as you said, it requires an adult, not an infant. So that's very good, Liam. Thanks.
Can I ask something before we move on? I was
Sure.
not here last week, and am I to assume correctly that did you guys meet last week?
Yes, we did.
And so last week you discussed the holy water. Was that
Yes.
took up the whole hour? Is that right?
I don't think so.
Okay. Because if we ended on a kind face the week before when I was here, and then we started humility and compassion. Okay.
Did we meet last week? I'm reasonably certain we did, but I couldn't swear to it.
Yes, Brother Shankara, we met, but you had some issues, so you went to rest.
Right. I was ill. So thank you. Yes, they may have spent the whole time on that one poem.
Okay.
Yes, we did.
Did okay, because I'm like just putting it together in my head and going, okay. And I could see that happening, but I just was checking.
Well, yes. Now that it was brought to my mind by Swayam, I did have some gastritis last week and had to retire from the field.
Okay. Glad to see you're back tonight.
Well, I'm feeling pretty well tonight.
Good.
So Cindy, would you like to read No One Knows His Name?
I was going to ask if I could read that. Okay. No one knows his name. No one knows his name. The man who lives on the streets and walks around in rags. Once I saw that man in a dream. He and God were constructing an extraordinary temple. I'll read again.
Please.
No one knows his name. No one knows his name. A man who lives on the streets and walks around in rags. Once I saw that man in a dream. He and God were constructing an extraordinary temple.
Swami Vivekananda often lived on the streets in rags when he was wandering throughout India. And I think he was sort of insulted one time in a railway station by somebody that didn't recognize the enormity of Swamiji's personality.
Oh, he was more than insulted. I don't know that we want to take time with that story tonight, but that was quite a story about Swami Vivekananda in rags. But this poem to me seems to be about a homeless man, a man who lives on the streets and walks around in rags. And it's just so moving, because if anyone can be believed, I think St. Francis of Assisi can be believed. And of course, his idea about dreams was, as we know from other things that we read in his work, he didn't consider dreams to be an unreal place. So when he says, once I saw that man in a dream, he and God were constructing an extraordinary temple. Well, there's the first world, the world of waking awareness. The second world, the world of dream sleep. And in that world, this man who seemed so incompetent in the world of waking awareness, he lived on the streets and walks around in rags. He was extraordinarily competent in the second.
Well, what I got from that was a man that did not know God. And he was doing all kinds of things that does not represent spirituality or goodness. And something happened that brought God to his attention. And he was going over in his mind God and considering maybe this is an alternative to where I have been living and the things that I've been doing, that kind of thing.
Well, that's a like has been said many times in this reading and discussion group. There are no correct interpretations of poems. There's only what each of us hears, and I think that's a very interesting reading of the poem that you just gave us. Very interesting.
Brother Shankara, something resonates this to me. If I look back in India, a lot of temples and monuments were built by people who didn't have any names. Most every monument like Taj Mahal was built by people. We don't know the names. In temples also, we don't know the names of those people who built. They built such beautiful, beautiful stuff. I'm sure that's the case in Europe too. It just brings that to my mind. Only people who donated the money, their names are carved on the temple, but not the people who built the temple with these people who are really like homeless. They don't have any big life, very simple life, simple living people. That's what brought to my mind with this poem.
Beautiful.
Brother Shankara,
Yes, dear.
there is a poem in Hindi by Tulsidas.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, basically, the translation sort of goes like this, that Tulsi meets everybody with immense love because he doesn't know in whose form Narayana will present.
Mm-hmm.
So, a homeless person could be a Swami Vivekananda that we are just not recognizing.
Amen to that. And we can only hope that our vision is clear enough to where we don't bring any judgment, that we bring Tulsidas's vision to that moment, not someone, not a judging. And certainly that seems to be what St. Francis is doing here.
Brings to my mind someone who is truly what I would consider homeless. Not just someone who's, very poor, um, or because it says no one knows his name.
Right.
And, even a lot of homeless people are not unknown. There are people who know their name. But this sounds like someone who's truly alone and truly, yeah, lives on the streets, is homeless. And, when we think,
Walks around in rags.
and when we think of homeless people today, a lot of homeless people, certainly not all of them, but there are a lot of homeless people who are homeless because they are mentally ill, and which, whatever that means, um, they don't think like everybody else. Their brain operates differently, and the world isn't made for them to operate in. So they're homeless, and no one knows them, and they walk around in rags, but God knows them.
Yes.
God knows their name, his name. And this, what you said about, in the second world, that these people who are unable to live like the mainstream of humanity, and they are just really on the outside and on the fringes and just getting by however they get by in their rags and nameless and homeless. But we have no idea what's going on in their interior world, which is where we all live anyway. And St. Francis seems to be saying, this guy was in my dream, and I saw he and God were building this extraordinary temple.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Something was going on in the second world that didn't have a whole lot to do with what was going on in the world of waking awareness. Anything else from anyone?
Yeah, just one thing came to my mind as I was listening to a couple people share, and the really reminded me of the conversation that had occurred earlier about the humility, the poem "Humility and Compassion," and that's something that kind of came to my mind, because before people were talking about people in prison and serial killers, and in this case is the poem is about a homeless person, and it's like in all of these people, I guess you could say, like the spirit or the light of God is in everyone, even in a serial killer. So even though their acts may be um, not commendable, they still have God in them, and it's kind of a very difficult thing for me to, I guess, accept. But if I'm really striving to really believe that, that's kind of a notion that I have to start, I guess, at least attempting to digest if I really want to have true compassion and really see God in everything and everyone.
Yes. We must begin to see the divine, the living presence within ourselves through our spiritual practices, and understand that that is the motive power in the world, not our thoughts and opinions. Those are just passing moments. This thought, that thought. We may cling to our opinions, which is an unfortunate way of being. Thank you, Liam. That was good. So, anything else before we move on to like roots? Catherine, are you with us having your book open?
Yes, I am.
Okay, would you like to read the poem Like Roots?
I'll read it.
Thank you.
Like roots. Our hands imbibe like roots. So I place them on what is beautiful in this world. And I fold them in prayer, and they draw from the heavens light. Like roots. Our hands imbibe like roots. So I place them on what is beautiful in this world. And I fold them in prayer, and they draw from the heavens light.
Thank you, Catherine. I think this first phrase, this first sentence, is so unusual and so it says something that if we take it seriously will change our idea about what our hands are. Our hands imbibe like roots. They soak up what is there. So I place them on what is beautiful in the world because they're imbibing like roots, they will take up the beauty. And by inference, I don't place them on what is inauspicious, what is unpleasant in the world. Now, in India, there is something called yoga psychology. It is formalized in something called Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. And in that scripture, this same idea appears. And we just had something called a puja here yesterday, a worship of the Divine Mother. And the person performing the worship, they would understand this poem very, very well, because their hands are both imbibing the beauty, the beautiful that they are touching and involved with, and they hold them in special kinds of ways to bring in the light. So I'd never read anything like this from a Western perspective when I read this poem. So it was very, very interesting to me. Our hands imbibe like roots. And once again, I remind myself over and over, St. Francis speaks simply and sincerely. Anyone else have anything they'd like to contribute and share about this poem?
Yeah, just sorry.
Go ahead, Len. Go ahead. I'll come.
Oh. Well, I just wanted to say, what you were talking about the roots. When I think of roots, I think of, the roots are where a tree or a plant draws its nutrients from, right? That's the source of what either lets it flourish or, kills it if it's not getting sufficient nutrients. So kind of when it's like, seeking to do things or kind of nourish ourselves with the things that are beautiful in this world, right? Like our hands, we have the freedom to, like a plant is kind of can take what is there or that comes to it, whereas we have a little bit more agency in being able to choose what kind of things that we place our hands on to nourish ourselves. So hopefully we're choosing beautiful things.
Thank you, Liam.
In India, children are often taught this prayer when they wake up the first thing in the morning. It's in Sanskrit, but it's sort of like Lakshmi resides in the tip of the fingers, Saraswati resides in the middle of the hands, and Krishna lives in the wrist. And so they are taught to rub their hands and face it on their eyes when they first open their eyes in the morning.
Oh, beautiful. Lakshmi on the fingertips, Saraswati in the
Middle.
palm of the hand.
And Krishna in the base.
Beautiful.
Well, the roots of a tree or plant is, for me, is the most unattractive part of the tree. But it is a very important part of the tree because it's the part that feeds the tree. And the only association that I could make with roots and hands, or that the hands, we bring things to us with the hands, and the roots brings nutrients to the tree. But as far as the attractiveness of it, that escapes me.
Hmm. Well, all of us who grew up being taught in the Christian perspective to fold our hands in prayer, that's what the second part of this is about. And I fold them, my hands, I fold them in prayer. And they draw from the heavens light. So in the Indian way of speaking, the Sanskrit way of speaking, the folding your hands in prayer is a mudra. And what St. Francis is saying, that when you put your hands in that position, they draw from the heavens light. The most beautiful thing.
Okay.
The hands imbibe like roots. And when we put them in this special position, then they draw from the heavens light.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robert.
Brother Shankar, this is
Yes,
kind
please, dear.
it just kind of reminds me the namaste in India. So I was told that the divinity in me honors the divinity in you when we fold the hands together and say namaste.
Yes,
That's what I was told, and it kind of reminded me that too. I
yes,
put them in prayer and they draw from the heavens light. It's like you bow to you. This my divinity honors your divinity within you.
mm-hmm.
Thing. That's what I read somewhere. And also, when I see, so I place them on what is beautiful in this world, that line reminds me a mother places her hand on the baby, that is how the baby knows that's the mother. It's the most beautiful thing. The baby recognizes, that just kind of clicked into my head, how the babies recognize mom and dad, especially the mother, when she holds the baby and she touches her head or whatever it is, then the mother knows. I mean, the baby knows that's their mom without,
Yes,
yes, those are the two things that came to my mind. Thank you.
beautiful. And yes, the baby feels a great deal from the hands that hold it.
One little also interjection, just something this poem, another poem this poem made me think of is a poem very short by Theodore Redke that's just simply God bless the roots, body and soul are one.
Mm. Mm.
He wrote often about growing things and roots and bulbs and dirt and
Mm.
kinds of wonderful things. So he would have liked this poem if he,
Oh, but he knew of it
yeah,
in whatever form it was.
right.
God bless the roots, body and soul are one. Mm. Beautiful.
Talking about babies and hands, I just felt like I have to share when I used to make rounds in the newborn nursery,
Mm-hmm.
and babies would instinctively, I mean, they do, their hands are fisted when in this, for several days, but when they're startled and they open their hands, they just go around grabbing, trying to grab something. It's their own hair or their shirt, or if we place our fingers in their palms, and they just seem to get comfort from holding onto something.
Ah, drawing from the light. Yes. It's probably a good thing that we don't remember what it's like to be a tiny infant, because it must be very frightening. Vladimir Nabokov, the great writer Vladimir Nabokov, he was able to accurately remember, according to his own testimony, being a very young infant on the porch of the house that he was raised in Russia, in his, I think he called it bassinet, in the sunshine. And he registers what a strange experience it was. So, two things from this poem stick with me. You know, we have to be careful where we place our hands, our attention. It's one of the key Zen koans is, where are your hands? Zen Buddhism has many little teachings in the form of what they call koans, these little questions. And so one of them is, where are your hands? So place them on what is beautiful in the world. And then this evocation, this remarking on, as I said, what in India would be called a mudra, this way of folding our hands in prayer. And he says that there's significance in that we don't perhaps know, that they then draw from the heaven's light when we place them together, fold them in prayer. We've got just a few minutes. I so love this next poem, I want to read it myself. And we don't really have time to discuss it tonight, but we'll read it again first thing next time. And one of the reasons I like it so well is it gives us a peep into St. Francis's sense of humor. And it's shown right away in the first sentence. The title is God Would Kneel Down. I think God might be a little prejudiced. For once he asked me to join him on a walk through this world, and we gazed into every heart on this earth. And I noticed that he lingered a bit longer before any face that was weeping, and before any eyes that were laughing. And sometimes when we passed a soul in worship, God would kneel down. I have come to learn God adores his creation. So I'll read it again. God would kneel down. I think God might be a little prejudiced. For once he asked me to join him on a walk through this world, and we gazed into every heart on this earth. And I noticed he lingered a bit longer before any face that was weeping, and before any eyes that were laughing. And sometimes when we passed a soul in worship, God would kneel down. I have come to learn God adores his creation. So it's 9 o'clock. I know Swayam has to be off to another class.
Yes, Brother Shankara. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. It was a wonderful class. Look forward to next time.
Good night, Swayam.
Good night.
Thank you.
Go in Mother's loving and protective embrace.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Good night.
Night.
This
Bye-bye.
little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Shine, shine, shine. Good night, everyone. Om Hari Om Tat Sat. Jai Shri Ramakrishna, Jai Yesudeva. Beloved Mother Mary, beloved Sri Sharada Devi, we invoke your blessings. We ask that you care for us, that you look lovingly on us, that you support and nourish us. Jai Shri Guru Maharaj Ji Ki Jai, Durga, Durga, Durga. May you go in Mother's loving and protective embrace. Until tomorrow night, if you want to join us for the class on the life of Holy Mother. Wednesday night, we'll talk about Swamiji's Jnana Yoga. We're starting chapter 2. So, any of you would like to join us, the links are on the website. Good night, everyone.
Thank you for this evening.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Night.
Good
Thank you,
night.
everyone. Good night.
Bye.